My name is Captain Rachel Grant. I'm 32 years old and I'm a Black Hawk pilot in the United States Army. Tonight is my birthday. I'm sitting in the familiar living room of my parents' house in Georgia, still in my camouflage uniform because I rushed to make it on time. My father, Rick, gets to his feet, holding a gift wrapped in cheap blue paper. He lets out a booming laugh, the kind he thinks is hilarious. Happy birthday to my little pilot girl. He hands me the box. Inside, under a sheet of tissue paper, is a plastic toy soldier helmet, the kind you buy at a dollar store, with the word Captain scrawled across it in black marker. The room erupts in laughter. See? My father slaps his knee. I told you it was just like an expensive video game. I feel the blood drain from my face. They had no idea that just a few months later, a civilian helicopter would fall out of the sky over a canyon, and this game would be the only thing that could save 5 lives. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had your own family dismiss the career you bled for. The laughter swelled around me, a thick, sticky wave of sound that felt like the Georgia humidity in August. It pressed in, filling my ears until the individual voices of my aunts, uncles, and cousins blurred into a single, buzzing drone, like angry bees trapped in a jar. My fingers were clamped around the flimsy plastic helmet, the cheap material cool and smooth against my skin. I could feel a slight tremor in my hands, a vibration that started deep in my chest and was working its way out. My mother, a woman who had made a career out of smoothing over my father's rough edges, gave a nervous little laugh. "Oh, Rick, stop teasing her," she said, her voice a placating murmur. But my father was basking in the glow of his own joke, his chest puffed out with self-satisfaction. He took a long swallow of his Budweiser, his eyes twinkling over the top of the can. "What teasing? It's just a joke." "What's the matter? Can't take a joke, Captain." He leaned on the word Captain, drawing it out, twisting my rank into a punchline. He made it sound like a Halloween costume. My gaze dropped to my own uniform. The real one. The fabric was stiff, functional, smelling faintly of jet fuel and the dry, air-conditioned chill of a cockpit. I thought of the endless physical fitness tests under a punishing Alabama sun, the hundreds of hours in flight simulators until my eyes burned, the nights spent awake, poring over technical manuals thicker than dictionaries. I thought of the moment I was handed my wings, the weight of the metal pin in my palm feeling more real than anything I'd ever held. I'd earned every thread of this uniform, paid for it with sweat and exhaustion and a relentless, grinding determination. And in my father's eyes, all of that effort, all of that sacrifice, was worth no more than this dollar store piece of plastic. This toy. I didn't cry. Army discipline wouldn't let me. Crying was a loss of control, and in my world, a loss of control meant people could die. So I contained it. I built a wall inside my mind, brick by brick, shutting the pain behind it. My face felt like a mask, frozen and numb. Slowly, deliberately, I placed the plastic helmet on the dining table. It landed with a soft, hollow clatter next to the half-eaten sheet cake my mother had made, its bright blue frosting spelling out, "Happy birthday, Rachel." The mockery sat beside the celebration, a perfect, brutal summary of my life here. The laughter in the room sputtered and died. The silence that followed was heavy, awkward. I could feel my relatives shifting in their seats, suddenly finding the pattern on the wallpaper intensely fascinating. They recognized the shift in the atmosphere. They knew I wasn't laughing along. With measured movements, I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping softly against the polished hardwood floor. I pushed it neatly back under the table. "Thanks for dinner, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice I used to give commands over the intercom, calm and clear in the heart of a storm. My father's jovial expression curdled into a scowl. "Hey, where are you going? The party's not over." He gestured around the room with his beer can. "Don't be so sensitive, Rachel. It was just a joke." I finally looked at him, really looked at him. I met his gaze across the table, over the remnants of the pot roast and mashed potatoes. The wall inside me was holding. I'm not having fun, I said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the silent room with the force of a gavel. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, undeniable fact. Then I turned my back on him, on all of them. I walked towards the front door, my combat boots making solid, rhythmic sounds on the floor. Each step was a declaration. I could hear my mother's quiet, distressed, "Rachel, wait!" But it was my father's voice that followed me out onto the porch, booming with anger and wounded pride. "Rachel, you get back in here right now. You're ruining the party." I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The humid night air hit me as I stepped outside, but it wasn't until I slammed the heavy door of my Ford F-150 shut that I finally allowed myself to breathe. The sound echoed in the quiet street, a sharp crack that severed my connection to the house. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there in the dark, the faint glow of the porch light filtering through the windshield. I leaned forward and rested my forehead against the cool, worn leather of the steering wheel. A shuddering gasp tore through me, but no tears came. The sob was a hard, painful knot lodged in my throat. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't the first joke, the first dismissive comment, the first time my career was treated like a strange and expensive hobby. But this was the worst. This was public. This was a carefully planned performance for the benefit of our entire family. I've flown a 40,000-pound Black Hawk through thunderstorms that threw us around the sky like a leaf. I've landed in near-zero visibility conditions in the dead of night, trusting only my instruments and my training. I've been responsible for the lives of my entire crew and the soldiers we carried. I could handle that. I could handle physical danger and immense professional pressure. But I couldn't handle the casual, smiling contempt from my own father. That plastic helmet wasn't just a thoughtless gift. It was a confirmation of my deepest, most persistent fear, that no matter what I accomplished, no matter how high I flew, in his eyes, I would never, ever be good enough. My hand fumbled for the ignition key. I had to get out of there. I wiped at my eyes, angry at the moisture that had finally escaped. The engine rumbled to life, a low, steady growl that was more comforting than any voice had been tonight. My headlights sliced through the Georgia darkness, illuminating the quiet, tree-lined street. I put the truck in drive. I'm not coming back. Not like this. I'm not letting this go anymore. As I pulled away from the curb, an image flashed into my mind. An email I'd received last week, one I'd been ignoring. An offer for a 6-month deployment. Tactical air transport, forward operating base, Middle East. It was tough, demanding, and a world away from here. In that instant, sitting in the cab of my truck with the ghost of my family's laughter still ringing in my ears, the decision became crystal clear. I was going to take it. I had to go. I needed to be in a place where my worth was measured by my skill and my nerve, not by the suffocating weight of family prejudice. As I steered the truck toward the highway, toward the direction of Fort Novosel, I made a vow to myself. This is the last time I let him make me feel this small. The noise of the party was behind me, but the noise in my head was just getting started. The miles dissolved under the wheels of my truck, the steady hum of the engine a lonely constant in the dark. The windows were down, and the cool Georgia night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It should have been calming, but my mind was a vortex. Why? Why did that cheap piece of plastic feel like a physical blow? It was, as my father had insisted, just a joke. But it wasn't. It was the latest addition to a vast and detailed map of injustice, a map that had been drawn inside of me, line by painful line, for the last 10 years. The helmet wasn't the wound, it was just the salt poured into it. The first line on that map was drawn when I was 22. I was about to ship out to Fort Moore for officer candidate school, buzzing with a nervous energy that felt like electricity under my skin. My whole future was laid out in front of me, a path I'd fought for and chosen for myself. In the weeks leading up to my departure, my father's old, beat-up Ford F-150, the very same model I was driving now, just years newer, died on him. The transmission was shot. For a week, the house was filled with his grumbling, a dark cloud of complaints about the repair costs and the inconvenience. I had just received my enlistment bonus, a small nest egg I'd planned to save. Without a second thought, I went to the bank, withdrew every dollar, and handed the cash to him. "Here, Dad," I said. "Get the truck fixed." He looked surprised for a moment, then his face settled into its usual gruffness. He took the money and nodded. "Yeah, okay, good." He didn't say thank you. He didn't say he was proud of me. He just took the money that my commitment to the Army had provided and used it to fix the symbol of his own working man's world. 2 weeks later, I stood on the parade ground at Fort Moore, my back ramrod straight, my new uniform, crisp and unfamiliar. It was my OCS graduation. My parents were there, but my father arrived late. He stood at the back of the crowd, his arms crossed over his chest, his hands still bearing the faint stains of engine grease. He kept checking his watch. Later, at the awkward lunch that followed, his only comments were about how far he'd had to drive and how the ceremony had made him miss his Saturday morning golf game. He never once mentioned the gold bars pinned to my collar. He never mentioned that his daughter had just become an officer in the United States Army. That was one line on the map. The next was drawn in a much bolder, brighter color. The color of my brother, Ethan, the golden child. Ethan was 4 years younger than me, a business major who floated through college with respectable but unremarkable grades. When he was ready to apply for jobs, he was struggling. So I stepped in. For 3 consecutive nights after my own long days of flight training at Fort Novosel, I stayed up with him over video calls, rewriting his resume, crafting cover letters, coaching him on interview questions. I poured my discipline and focus into his future. When he finally landed an entry-level job as a client associate at a local bank, my father threw a massive backyard barbecue. I can still smell the charcoal and the sizzling burgers. He stood on the deck, one arm slung proudly around Ethan's shoulders, a cold beer in his other hand. "This is it, everyone," he announced to our assembled family and friends. "This is the future of the Grant family. My son. He's got a real job, making real money." People cheered and clapped Ethan on the back. Later, I overheard one of my uncles ask about me. "How's Rachel doing with all that flying stuff?" My father let out a short, derisive laugh. "Her? She still gets dizzy on a merry-go-round. I have no idea why the Army bothers wasting all that fuel on her." The words hit me from across the lawn, sharp and precise as shrapnel. I was wasting their fuel. I was a bad investment. Ethan, with his 9-to-5 desk job, was the blue-chip stock. I was just a novelty, a foolish risk. That sentiment became a familiar chorus, the background music of my life. The dismissal became a routine. Every Thanksgiving, gathered around the table, someone would politely ask about my job. I'd try to explain the complexities of formation flying, the intense concentration required for night vision goggle missions. My father would invariably cut me off. "So, you basically play a fancy video game all day, right? Like that thing Ethan has, only yours costs the taxpayers a lot more." My mother, in her own way, was just as dismissive. Her concern was a form of belittlement. "I just wish you were safe, Rachel," she'd say, her brow furrowed with worry. "Maybe you could ask to transfer to a desk job." They didn't understand that I was commanding a multi-million-dollar piece of machinery that lives depended on my decisions. They didn't want to understand. To them, my reality was an inconvenient and slightly embarrassing story. They needed me to be small, to be safe, so that my dangerous, unfeminine career path wouldn't overshadow Ethan's sensible, predictable one. The final defining line on the map was drawn last Christmas. We were all gathered in the living room, the floor littered with torn wrapping paper. Ethan's big gift from my parents was a brand new set of Callaway golf clubs. It was an investment in his image, in his ability to network on the golf course with other real businessmen. My gift was a Macy's gift card. "There you go," my father said with a wink. "That's in case you get tired of playing Army and want to buy some real clothes to wear." Real clothes. As if my uniform, a symbol of service and honor recognized around the world, was a costume I put on for pretend. And the saddest part? I laughed. I smiled and said thank you and let it go. Because that's what I always did. I always let it go. For years, I told myself a story. If I just worked harder, flew higher, earned another promotion, then he would finally see. Then I would earn his respect. But as I drove through the darkness, the plastic helmet on the passenger seat like a silent accusation, I finally understood. The story I'd been telling myself was a lie. It didn't matter what I did. I could fly to the moon and plant a flag, and my father would still just see the little girl who got dizzy on a merry-go-round. I was the supporting character in the story of my own family. If you know what it feels like to be the other one, the one who tried twice as hard for half the recognition, show your support and hit that like button. And in the comments, just type, "I see you." Because for all those years, it felt like nobody did. After tonight, I finally realized the only person whose recognition I truly needed was my own. The decision, once made in the darkness of my truck, settled in my bones with the weight of cold, hard steel. There was no more hesitation. The next morning, I walked into my commanding officer's office at Fort Novosel before the sun had fully risen, the air still cool and damp. I stood before his desk, squared my shoulders, and accepted the 6-month deployment. A tactical air transport unit stationed at a forward operating base in the Middle East. Heavy workload, harsh conditions, high stakes. It was exactly what I needed. My CO looked at my file, then up at me. "You sure, Grant? This isn't a training rotation." "I'm sure, sir," I said. The phone call home was a necessary evil, an obstacle to be cleared. I made it from a payphone on base, the receiver feeling heavy and foreign in my hand. My mother answered, and when I told her, her voice cracked. I could hear the tears welling up, the familiar sound of her helpless worry. Then she passed the phone to my father. I didn't even have to say hello. "Are you insane?" His voice exploded through the line, a raw, furious roar that needed no amplification. "I told you to get a desk job. Are you doing this just to spite me? Just to prove some kind of point?" The accusations washed over me, but for the first time, they didn't penetrate. The wall I had built the night before was holding firm. "This is my job, Dad," I said, my voice calm, almost detached. And before he could unleash another volley, I hung up. I didn't slam the phone down. I placed it gently back in its cradle, the click of the plastic a small, final sound. An ending. Packing my gear felt different this time. It wasn't just a routine preparation for another assignment, it was an escape. Each rolled-up t-shirt, each pair of socks, each carefully folded uniform felt like a step away from the person I was expected to be. I felt a strange and profound sense of relief. At least out there, in the vast anonymous expanse of the desert, I wouldn't have to explain myself to anyone. My rank and my wings would be the only introduction I needed. The moment I stepped off the C-130 transport plane, the heat hit me like a physical force. It was a dry, suffocating blast that stole the air from my lungs and baked the moisture from my skin. The world wasn't just a different place. It was a different planet. Everything was coated in a fine, pale dust that got into my mouth, my eyes, my hair. The entire base was a sprawling city of beige and tan. Beige tents, tan concrete barriers, beige shipping containers converted into offices and barracks. The only colors were the American flag whipping in the hot wind and the muted greens and browns of the uniforms. The work started immediately. There was no gentle orientation, no grace period. I was assigned a call sign, a crew, and a flight schedule. We flew transport missions, moving supplies and personnel between bases. We flew at night, the world below a dark, featureless void seen through the ethereal green glow of our night vision goggles. We flew through sudden, violent sandstorms that reduced visibility to zero and tested the limits of both the machine and its pilot. This wasn't the controlled environment of training flights over the Alabama pine forests. This was real. My UH-60 Blackhawk became my entire world. My office, my sanctuary, my responsibility. The pressure was immense, a constant low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of my military calm. Every decision mattered. A small miscalculation, a moment of hesitation, could have catastrophic consequences. One night, flying a low-level route through a mountain pass, our primary GPS system flickered and died. For a split second, navigating by backup instruments and visual landmarks in the dark, My father's voice echoed in my head, sharp and mocking. Just playing a fancy video game. My flight suit was soaked with sweat, my hands gripping the cyclic stick so tightly my knuckles were white. I will not fail, I thought, the words a silent, ferocious chant. I focused on my instruments, on my co-pilot's voice, on the feel of the aircraft responding to my touch. We landed safely. No one on my crew ever knew about the battle I had just fought in my own mind. The unit was filled with seasoned aviators, men who had been flying in this part of the world for years. They were quiet, professional, and they communicated in a language of efficiency and action. They judged you not by your record or your rank, but by your performance in the air. As the new captain, and one of the few women, I felt a familiar pressure to prove myself. Only this time, it was tenfold. The first few weeks were crushingly lonely. I ate my meals alone in the loud, clattering dining facility, surrounded by hundreds of soldiers but connected to none of them. I performed my pre-flight checks in solitude, the methodical routine, a comfort in the isolation. I missed home, but it was a strange, abstract kind of homesickness. I didn't miss the arguments or the tension of my parents' house. I missed the idea of belonging somewhere, so I threw myself into the only thing I had, the work. I memorized flight corridors, studied enemy threat assessments, learned the technical specifications of my Black Hawk until I knew it better than I knew myself. I didn't need to be liked. I needed to be the best. Not for my father, not anymore, but for the soldiers whose lives would soon be in my hands. Slowly, gradually, I found my rhythm. The desert, which at first had seemed like a hostile, alien landscape, began to reveal its secrets. I learned to read the subtle shifts in the wind, to anticipate the turbulence that came off the sun-baked mountains. I learned to trust my gut, that deep, instinctual pilot sense that tells you when something is wrong long before the instruments do. All the discipline from OCS, all those hundreds of hours in the cockpit at Fort Novosel, it all began to crystallize. I wasn't the girl who got dizzy on a merry-go-round. I was a pilot. The shift was almost imperceptible. It wasn't a single event, but a series of small ones. Then came the medevac call. An IED strike, multiple casualties, urgent extraction needed. A small but vicious sandstorm was kicking up, reducing visibility. Protocol suggested waiting, but these soldiers didn't have time to wait. I made the call. We're going in. The flight was tense, a battle against the elements. We landed hard, the crew chiefs providing suppressive fire while the medics loaded the wounded. We were on the ground for less than 90 seconds. The flight back was just as harrowing, but we made it. We delivered the wounded soldiers to the surgical hospital. Later that evening, as my crew and I were debriefing, a few of the enlisted crew chiefs, tough-as-nails guys in their 20s, caught my eye. They just nodded at me. It wasn't praise, it wasn't a salute, it was just a simple, quiet nod. A gesture of respect, of trust. It was a small thing, a flicker of recognition in the dusty twilight of a foreign country. But it felt more real, more valuable than anything I'd ever received in my own home. That quiet nod of respect after the medevac mission was a beginning. It was the first crack of light in a long, dark room. It wasn't a floodgate opening. It was a subtle shift, a change in the air. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for weeks began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of professional belonging. And the center of that shift was my crew chief, Sergeant First Class Williams. Everyone called him Sarge. He was a man approaching 50, with skin like tanned leather and eyes that had seen more desert sunrises than I could count. He was a man of few words, and in the beginning, his silence was intimidating. He watched me constantly. When I did my pre-flight checks, he'd do his own right after, his eyes scanning every bolt and hydraulic line I had just inspected. It wasn't about mistrust, it was about verification. He was a steward of the machine, and he wasn't about to hand the keys over to a new pilot without being absolutely certain she knew what she was doing. The true test came about a month into my deployment. During a routine morning inspection, I was checking the tail rotor assembly. Everything looked fine on the surface, but something felt wrong. It was a pilot's instinct, a low hum of dissonance that you learn to never ignore. I ran my gloved hand over one of the pitch change links, and I felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible catch. I pulled my glove off and used my bare fingertips, tracing the metal until I found it. A hairline fracture, no thicker than a human hair, spider webbing out from a joint. It was the kind of thing you would miss if you were tired or complacent. It was the kind of thing that, under the stress of high-speed maneuvers, could cause the entire tail rotor to disintegrate. Sarge walked over, his expression unreadable. He had seen me linger. I simply pointed. He knelt, his own experienced eyes tracing the line of the crack. He was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up at me, and the guarded professional mask he always wore seemed to soften for just an instant. He gave a single, slow nod. "Good catch, Captain," he said, his voice a low gravel. "You just saved our lives." That was it. Just 9 simple words. There was no condescension in his tone, no patronizing surprise that I had found it. There was no hint of the patriarchal attitude my father wore like a second skin. It was pure, unvarnished respect, from one professional to another. It was an acknowledgement of my competence. That night, alone in my small, sterile room in the barracks, I sat on the edge of my cot and cried. They weren't the hot, angry tears of my birthday night. They were quiet tears of relief, of a profound and startling gratitude. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. From that day on, the dynamic shifted. My crew became my tribe. My co-pilot, Warrant Officer Joker Davis, was a lanky Texan who believed that a terrible pun was the best way to diffuse a tense situation. In the middle of a brownout landing, with dust so thick you couldn't see the ground, he'd key the intercom and say something like, "Well, ma'am, I guess you could say this mission is pretty down to earth." It was groan-worthy, but it always broke the tension. The 2 door gunners were kids, barely out of their teens, who complained endlessly about the powdered eggs in the dining facility, but who could field strip their M240 machine guns blindfolded. We became a unit, a self-contained world that operated on its own set of rules. We didn't talk about the families or the lives we'd left back in the States. That world was too far away, too complicated. Our reality was the roar of the turbine engines, the vibration of the rotor blades, the static crackle in our headsets. We talked about the aircraft. We talked about the mission. We put our lives in each other's hands every single day. When we were strapped into that cockpit, hurtling through the sky, nobody cared that I was a woman. They only cared if I could get them home safe. And I always did. The moment it all coalesced, the moment I truly understood what I had found, came on a sweltering night after a grueling 12-hour mission. We were all exhausted, soaked in sweat, every muscle aching. We sat in the cavernous main cabin of the Black Hawk, the engines ticking as they cooled. The air was thick with the smell of oil and hot metal. We passed around a canteen, taking swallows of the lukewarm, plastic-tasting water. No one spoke for a while. Then Sarge, who was leaning against the bulkhead, looked over at me. His voice was low and raspy with fatigue. "Captain," he said, "the great thing about being up there is that nobody gives a damn about your story on the ground. You can either fly or you can't. Everything else, it's just noise." His words hit me with the force of a physical impact. It's just noise. A lifetime of slights and insults, a cacophony of dismissive words, suddenly rearranged itself in my mind under that one simple heading. My father's sneering comments, playing a video game, dizzy on a merry-go-round, real clothes, all the things that had defined me, that had wounded me so deeply, they weren't the truth. They were just noise, the meaningless static of a man who couldn't understand my world. For the very first time, sitting in the belly of a war machine in the middle of a desert, I truly believed it. When my 6-month tour ended, there was a small, informal farewell gathering in one of the rec rooms. There were no speeches, just a few pizzas someone had managed to procure and some non-alcoholic beer. As the night was winding down, Sarge stood up and handed me a flat, rectangular object wrapped in a t-shirt. It was a wooden plaque. I unwrapped it carefully. Carved into the dark, polished wood was a detailed rendering of a UH-60 Black Hawk. Below it, engraved on a small brass plate, were the names of my entire crew: Sarge, Joker, and the two young gunners. And at the very bottom, a single line of text was etched into the plate. It read, "Captain Grant, the commander. We'd fly with you anywhere." I ran my fingers over the engraved words, over the smooth, cool wood. I held it tight against my chest. This was it. This was the recognition I had been chasing my whole life. It wasn't loud or flashy. It wasn't a party thrown in my honor. It was quiet, it was solid, and it was real. This was my family, a family not defined by blood or by name, but forged in the crucible of shared risk, built on a foundation of sweat, trust, and mutual respect. The wooden plaque Sarge had given me sat carefully packed in the center of my duffel bag, a solid, tangible piece of my new reality. It was a talisman I held onto during the long flight back to the United States. For the first time, I felt like I was returning home not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a professional returning from a job well done. The noise, I told myself, was gone. I had a new family, a new foundation. I felt strong. That strength began to fray the moment I made the call from the airport in Atlanta. My mother picked up on the second ring, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Rachel, oh, thank God you're home safe." For a few precious seconds, it was just pure, simple relief. But then, the old patterns began to creep back in, like weeds reclaiming a newly cleared field. "Your father has missed you so much," she said, her tone shifting into her familiar role as peacemaker. "He's been feeling bad about that whole birthday thing. You know how he is, honey. He was just joking." I gripped the phone, the hard plastic digging into my palm. The warmth I had been feeling chilled instantly. "Mom," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "I just commanded tactical flight missions in a combat zone for 6 months. I really don't have time for Dad's jokes anymore." There was a weary sigh on the other end of the line. "Oh, Rachel, you always make such a big deal out of things. Anyway, just get home soon. We're so excited to see you. And your brother Ethan, he has some wonderful news." Wonderful news. The phrase hung in the air, a premonition. I knew with a sinking certainty that whatever Ethan's news was, it would somehow manage to eclipse my own return. And I was right. When I pulled my truck into the driveway 2 days later, on the first day of my leave, I was greeted by the sight of colorful streamers hanging from the porch and a yard full of cars. The air was thick with the smell of grilling hot dogs and the sound of cheerful, familiar chatter. My father, it turned out, was throwing a party, a huge, celebratory barbecue. For Ethan, his wonderful news. He had been promoted to Assistant Vice President of Personal Banking. It was a classic corporate title, one that sounded impressive but, in reality, meant a minor step up the ladder and a slightly bigger cubicle. It was a perfectly respectable, perfectly ordinary achievement. But to my father, it was the moon landing. He was holding court on the back deck, a spatula in one hand, a beer in the other. He had his arm slung around Ethan, who was looking flushed and proud in a new polo shirt. "Here he is," my father boomed to a group of neighbors. "My son, he did it. The future of the Grant family, right here." The crowd of relatives and family friends murmured their approval, clapping Ethan on the back, shaking his hand. He was the center of the universe. I stood there for a moment, just inside the screen door, a ghost at my own brother's coronation. I was in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple t-shirt, but I could feel the desert still clinging to me. My skin was darker, tanned by a relentless sun. I was leaner, harder. I felt like a visitor from another world, an alien who had stumbled into a strange suburban ritual. My father finally spotted me. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes barely registered my presence. "Ah, Rachel's here," he announced to no one in particular. He gave me a quick, dismissive nod. "You look skinny. Guess the food over there wasn't much good, huh? Well, grab a plate. Today's all about your brother." And that was it. That was my welcome home. Not a single question about the last 6 months. Not a word about the missions, the danger, the sandstorms, the responsibility. It was as if I had just returned from a long trip to the grocery store. I looked at Ethan, preening under the spotlight, the same brother whose application essays I had practically written from scratch. He was being celebrated for a meaningless title, while my safe return from a place where people actively tried to kill you was worth less than a passing comment. I was invisible. I mumbled an excuse about being tired from the trip and escaped into the house. The noise of the party faded behind me as I walked down the hall to the guest bathroom. I needed a moment. I needed to breathe. I shut the door, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. I leaned against the cool wood, my eyes closed. Then I looked up and met my own gaze in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger. Her eyes were tired, weary in a way that had nothing to do with jet lag. A wave of exhaustion, profound and bone-deep, washed over me. I was so tired of trying, so tired of proving myself. Why did I keep coming back here? Why did I subject myself to this? I had the plaque in my duffel bag. I had the respect of my crew. I had Sarge's words echoing in my head. It's just noise. So why did I still crave a single, approving nod from this man, my father? A man who would rather celebrate a trivial promotion than acknowledge the life and death reality of his own daughter's career? Why did his opinion still have the power to hurt me? I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on my face. The shock of it was grounding. I looked back at my reflection, water dripping from my chin. The woman in the mirror was no longer a stranger. She was a captain in the United States Army. She had survived a combat zone. She could survive this. I took a deep, steadying breath. I wasn't going to let them break me. I wasn't going to let them make me invisible. I wouldn't be staying here long. The next few days passed in a tense, suffocating quiet. I kept to myself, using my remaining leave to map out my next career steps and catch up on sleep. I was a guest in my own childhood home, a polite stranger who avoided the living room when my father was watching TV. The resolution I'd found in the bathroom mirror had cooled into a hard, protective shell. I was counting down the hours until I could leave. The confrontation came 2 days before my scheduled return to base. My father called me into his home office, a room that had always felt like his personal kingdom. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling, decorated with pictures of construction sites and a large mounted base he'd caught years ago. He sat behind his imposing oak desk, the throne from which he ran his small construction company and his family. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing. "Rachel," he began, shuffling some papers. "The company needs a new excavator, a big purchase. Ethan mentioned the loan process at his bank is taking a while, you know how it is." He looked up at me, his expression casual, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. So I was thinking, you must have some savings built up from the army. You don't have many expenses after all. How about you lend the company some money, just to tide us over? I stared at him. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it stole my breath. For a moment, I was completely stunned into silence. This man who had spent a decade mocking my career, belittling my service, and dismissing my accomplishments as a childish game, was now asking to profit from it. He saw my uniform not as a symbol of honor, but as an indicator of a steady government paycheck. My sacrifice was, to him, a convenient financial resource. The noise that Sarge had talked about, the noise I thought I had silenced, came rushing back, louder and more dissonant than ever. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. "No? What do you mean, no?" "I mean no," I repeated, my voice gaining strength. "I don't have any money to lend you." His face darkened. The friendly businessman persona vanished, replaced by the angry patriarch. "Don't lie to me. You've been deployed for 6 months. Ungrateful," he spat the word. "After everything we've done for you, this is the thanks we get?" I didn't wait to hear the rest. I turned and walked out of the office, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. I had to get out of there. But my mother was waiting in the hallway, her face etched with anxiety. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Rachel, please," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "Don't make your father angry. He's under a lot of stress. We're family. You should help." That was it. That was the final straw. The word family, a word that should have meant safety and support, had just been weaponized. It was used as a tool of manipulation, a chain to pull me back into line. The dam of a lifetime of suppressed anger, of swallowed insults and bitten-back retorts, finally broke. Family, I asked, my voice dangerously low. Is that what this is? Does family treat their daughter like an ATM 1 minute and a joke the next, Mom? I pulled my arm free from her grasp and turned around. I walked back into the office. My father was still sitting at his desk, muttering about my selfishness. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mixture of anger and surprise at my defiance. Dad, I said. My voice was cold, clear, and steady. It was the voice of a commander. It was the voice of a woman who had finally reached her limit. I'm going to say this to you once, and I want you to listen. I am not playing Army. I am a captain in the United States Army. I command a flight crew. I am responsible for a $10 million helicopter and for the lives of the soldiers inside it. I am not your joke. I am not the girl who gets dizzy on a merry-go-round. I took a step closer to the desk, leaning forward slightly, forcing him to meet my gaze. And I will not give you 1 single cent of the money I've earned until you learn to respect the uniform I earned it in. He was speechless. His face flushed a deep, mottled red, a storm of fury gathering in his eyes. He finally found his voice, sputtering, You dare talk to your father like that? I stood up straight, my spine like a rod of steel. I'm done, Dad, I said, and the words felt like a physical release, like setting down a weight I had been carrying for my entire life. I am done trying to win your approval. I've earned respect from people who actually deserve to give it. I don't need yours anymore. My mother stood frozen in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. I walked past her, went to my room, and grabbed my packed duffel bag. I didn't say another word. I walked out the front door, down the porch steps, and to my truck without looking back. This time, as I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, I didn't cry. A profound, exhilarating sense of lightness filled me. It was terrifying, and it was liberating. The boundary had been drawn. The silence had been broken. I had finally, truly, freed myself. It took every ounce of courage I had to say those words. If you've ever had that enough is enough moment, that moment where you finally stood up for yourself, hit that like button to show some solidarity. And in the comments, I want you to simply write, I am not a joke. Let's fill the comments with that for everyone who needs to hear it and for everyone who has finally said it. After driving away from my parents' house, I didn't head straight back to the base. The confrontation had left me feeling hollowed out, strangely light. I had severed a rope that had been around my neck my whole life, and now, in the sudden freedom, I felt a desperate need for space, for silence. I had a few days of leave left, and for the first time, I decided to use them for myself. I drove west. I kept driving until the lush green humidity of Georgia gave way to the endless plains of Texas, and then further still, until the landscape began to rise and fold into the monumental shapes of the American Southwest. I didn't have a plan. I just followed the road until I saw a sign for Zion National Park in Utah. Something about it felt right. I needed to see something ancient and immovable, something that would make my own personal dramas feel as small and insignificant as they truly were. For 3 days, I lost myself in that cathedral of red rock. I hiked the trails alone, my boots crunching on the dusty sandstone paths. I followed the Virgin River as it carved its way through the canyon, the water a ribbon of impossible turquoise against the fiery orange cliffs. I stood at the top of scenic overlooks, surrounded by monoliths of stone that had stood silent for millions of years, and I felt the noise in my head finally begin to quiet. There were no phone calls, no emails, no expectations, just the vast, indifferent beauty of the landscape and the sound of the wind whispering through the narrow canyons. And in that quiet, I realized this was the first real vacation I had ever taken. It was the first time I had been truly alone, without the shadow of my family's judgment hanging over me. On my last evening, I wandered through the small gateway town of Springdale. It was a charming, rustic place with a handful of galleries and gear shops. I found a dusty little used bookstore tucked away on a side street, the air inside thick with the sweet, papery smell of old books. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but my eyes landed on a simple, slender paperback. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I'd heard the title before, in college maybe, but had never read it. I bought it, along with a lukewarm bottle of water, and took it back to my simple motel room. That night, with the noisy air conditioner rumbling in the window, I sat on the polyester bedspread and I read. And the world shifted. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic earthquake, but a slow, profound realignment of my entire perspective. Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, wrote about finding meaning even in the most horrific suffering imaginable. And one passage, one core idea, struck me with the force of a physical revelation. He wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." The book fell into my lap. I stared at the stuccoed wall of the motel room, but I wasn't seeing it. I was seeing my entire life, laid out with a new and devastating clarity. I had spent 10 years trying to change an unchangeable situation. I had dedicated myself to the monumental, impossible task of changing my father. I thought if I could just be better, stronger, more accomplished, I could change his perception of me. I could force him to see my worth, but I couldn't. I had been throwing myself against a solid rock wall, bruising myself over and over, hoping the wall would move. The situation, my father's deeply ingrained prejudice and favoritism, was unchangeable. And in that moment, I understood. I finally understood what the secret weapon was. It wasn't a plan for revenge. It wasn't about gathering evidence or winning an argument. It wasn't about money or success. The secret weapon was me. The only thing I had the power to change was myself. I couldn't change my father, but I could change the power his words had over me. I could change the way I allowed his opinions to define my own self-worth. It was exactly what Sarge had told me, but this was the first time I understood it on a cellular level. It's just noise. It's his noise, not mine. I didn't have to listen to it anymore. I could just let it go. And in that simple act of letting go, I could take back my own power. I decided, right there in that cheap motel room in the middle of the Utah desert, that from that moment on, my father's opinion of my career no longer had any value. It was irrelevant, it was static, it was just noise. The next day, my last day of leave, I felt a sense of peace that was entirely new to me. To celebrate, I decided to do something a little ironic, a little indulgent. I booked a seat on a civilian helicopter tour of the canyon. I just wanted to be a passenger for once. I wanted to see the sky, the one place where I always felt completely free, without any of the responsibility that usually came with it. I showed up at the small local airfield and joined the other tourists. There were 4 of us, plus the pilot. I took a seat in the back, content to just look out the window and enjoy the view. I had no idea that the book I had just read and the profound internal shift it had created was about to be put to the most violent and terrifying test imaginable. The sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. Below us, the canyon walls plunged thousands of feet, a breathtaking spectacle of layered red and orange rock. I was finally relaxing, letting the rhythmic chop of the rotor blades lull me into a state of peaceful observation. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was just a passenger, just another tourist taking pictures with her phone. And then it happened. Up front, the pilot made a sound, a strangled, guttural gasp. It wasn't a word, just a pure animal noise of distress. I looked up from my window, just in time to see his hands fly off the controls. He clutched at his chest, his body seizing violently, and then he slumped forward, unconscious, against the instrument panel. For a single frozen moment, there was nothing but the sound of the engine. And then the helicopter, a Bell 206, suddenly free from any guiding input, lurched violently to the side. The nose dropped. We were no longer flying. We were falling. The beautiful canyon walls weren't a spectacle anymore. They were a target, rushing up to meet us with terrifying speed. The cabin erupted into chaos. The other passengers started screaming. a high-pitched, panicked sound that pierced through the engine's roar. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing down. I could see the terrified face of the woman across from me, her mouth open in a silent O of horror. I could see the cracks and fissures in the rock wall we were plummeting towards. This is it, a small part of my brain registered. This is how it ends. But then, 10 years of training kicked in. A different part of my brain, the disciplined, cold, analytical part, took over. It was a hostile takeover of my consciousness. There was no thought, there was no fear. There was only the mission: fly the aircraft. I am an Army pilot. The words ripped out of my throat, not a request, but a command that sliced through the panic. In one fluid motion, I unbuckled my harness, lunged forward between the front seats, and shoved the unconscious pilot's torso off the controls. My hands found the cyclic and collective sticks, the familiar feel of them in my grasp, instantly grounding me. I was just seconds from impact. I pulled back hard on the cyclic, the entire airframe groaning in protest as I fought against our deadly momentum. The helicopter shuddered, the rotor blades biting into the air, and slowly, agonizingly, the nose began to lift. We stabilized no more than 50 feet from the canyon wall that would have obliterated us. Everyone be quiet and buckle up, now! My voice was the voice of Captain Grant. It was a voice that expected and received immediate obedience. The screaming stopped, replaced by terrified, ragged breaths. My mind was a blur of calculations. This aircraft was nothing like my Black Hawk. A UH-60 is a heavy, powerful, twin-engine beast. This Bell 206 was a sports car by comparison, light, nimble, and terrifyingly responsive. But the principles of flight were the same. Physics didn't change. I had control. While my hands kept the helicopter level, my eyes scanned the unfamiliar instruments, my brain processing the data. I grabbed the radio handset. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," I broadcast, my voice steady. "This is Helicopter November." I read the tail number off the dash. 74 Charlie. Pilot is incapacitated. I am a passenger. U.S. Army pilot. I have control of the aircraft. I looked down. There was nowhere to go. Sheer rock walls on both sides. Below us, there was nothing but jagged boulders and the fast-moving river. And then I saw it. A sliver of hope. A narrow sandbar. A tiny strip of gravel and sand running alongside a bend in the river. It wasn't an airfield. It wasn't even a landing zone. But it was our only chance. As I started to maneuver us toward it, my father's voice, cruel and mocking, echoed in my mind from years ago. "She still gets dizzy on a merry-go-round." A surge of pure, cold fury shot through me. "Shut up, Dad," I snarled to myself through gritted teeth. I kicked the rudder pedal, banking the helicopter sharply. "We're landing." The engine was screaming, and I knew we were losing power. I had to make a decision. I shouted over my shoulder at the passenger sitting behind the pilot's seat. "Check on the pilot. Check his breathing." The command gave him a task, a focus beyond his own fear. My entire world shrank to that tiny strip of land. There was no room for error, a controlled crash. That's what this was. An auto-rotation. A maneuver where you use the upward flow of air through the unpowered rotors to glide to the ground. I had practiced it hundreds of times in a simulator. I had never done it for real. The ground rushed up. I could see individual rocks, the swirl of the current in the river. My training took over, my hands and feet moving with a precision that felt detached from my conscious mind. I flared the aircraft at the last possible second, bleeding off airspeed, converting it into lift. The skids hit the ground hard. For a terrifying moment, we slid sideways on the loose gravel, the helicopter threatening to tip into the river. I fought the controls, every muscle in my body screaming with the strain. And then, we stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whine of the turbine, spinning down. And then, the sound of someone sobbing. Then, another. I reached up with a hand that had suddenly begun to shake uncontrollably, and I killed the engine. The rotor blades slowly slapped the air into silence. We were alive. We were on the ground. I had done it. My expensive video game had just saved 5 lives. The aftermath was a blur. The adrenaline crash left me feeling exhausted and hollow, my body trembling with a deep, cellular shock long after the danger had passed. Rescue crews arrived, the other passengers and the pilot were airlifted to a hospital, and I was swept into a whirlwind of debriefings, reports, and official statements. And then the story broke. It started as a local news item in Utah, then it exploded. Within 24 hours, it was a national sensation. My face was on every cable news network. The headlines were sensational, hyperbolic. Hero Army Captain saves 5 in dramatic canyon crash landing. The angel in the cockpit. The Army, recognizing a powerful PR opportunity, leaned into it hard. They flew me to Washington, D.C. for a press conference at the Pentagon. I stood at a podium in my dress uniform, blinking in the flash of 100 cameras, feeling like an imposter. I hated it. I hated the attention, the fawning praise, the way they tried to turn 12 minutes of sheer, gut-wrenching terror into a feel-good news story. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a pilot who had been in the wrong place at the right time. I had done my job. I had reacted as I had been trained to react. But as I watched the news clips in my hotel room that night, a single, bitter thought kept circling in my mind. Are you watching this, Dad? Do you see me now? The first call from home came the next morning. It was my mother. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Rachel, oh my God, Rachel, we saw you on the news. You were so brave. You're incredible. I am so proud of you. Her pride was a raw, visceral thing, but it was laced with a kind of bewildered shock. Why didn't you ever tell us you could do things like that? Her question, meant with love, landed like a slap in the face. A cold, hard anger, an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel during the crisis, suddenly rose up in me. I tried to tell you, I said, my voice flat and icy. I tried to tell you for 10 years. Every time I came home and talked about my training, every time I described a mission, you didn't listen. You thought I was playing a game. You told me to get a desk job. It's not my fault you weren't paying attention. The other end of the line went silent. It was a heavy, guilty silence, one that said more than any apology could. She knew I was right. After a moment, she just whispered, "Oh, Rachel." And the conversation died. The call I was truly dreading came a few hours later. My father. His voice was different, stripped of its usual booming confidence. It was rough, hesitant, the voice of a man who didn't know what to say. Rachel, I saw the news. You did good. Real good. I'm proud of you. You're a hero. There they were, the words I had spent my entire adult life desperate to hear. I'm proud of you, but hearing them now, they felt hollow, meaningless. They were a currency that had lost all its value. It was like being given a glass of water after you'd already died of thirst. I'm not a hero, I said, cutting him off. My voice was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. I'm a trained pilot. I did my job. It's the same job I was doing for 6 months in the desert, the 6 months you never once asked me about. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, a ragged, uncertain sound. I'm sorry, Rachel, he finally managed to say. I was wrong. It was the closest he had ever come to a real apology, but I couldn't let it go. Not yet. The wound was too deep, and this felt like a bandage that was too small, applied too late. Are you sorry because you were wrong? I asked, the question precise and brutal. Or are you sorry because I was on TV? He sighed, a long, weary exhalation of defeat. I don't know, he said honestly. Both, I guess. I didn't say goodbye. I just ended the call. A few weeks later, after the media frenzy had finally died down, I stood on a parade ground once again. This time, a 4-star general stood in front of me. He spoke of courage, of extraordinary skill under pressure. And then he pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to the chest of my dress uniform. It was one of the highest honors an aviator could receive. The medal was heavy in a way the dollar store helmet had been light. It felt real. It felt earned. As the general stepped back and the applause began, I didn't think about my father. I didn't think about the news cameras or the headlines. I thought about Sarge and his quiet, knowing nod. I thought about Joker's terrible puns in the middle of a tense flight. I thought about the wooden plaque in my duffel bag, the one that said, "We'd fly with you anywhere." They were the ones who had seen me. They knew my value long before I had to land a falling helicopter to prove it. Their respect was the real metal. This one, the one shining on my chest, was just a piece of metal. The Distinguished Flying Cross, the media interviews, the title of hero, they weren't an ending. They were a doorway. In the months that followed, the Army recognized that my value wasn't just in the cockpit of a single aircraft, but in my ability to shape the pilots who would fly the entire fleet. I was promoted to major and given a new assignment, a return to Fort Novosel, not as a student, but as an instructor pilot. My life found a new rhythm, one defined not by the high-stakes adrenaline of missions, but by the steady, profound satisfaction of teaching. I spent my days in the Alabama sky, flying with young, eager warrant officers and lieutenants, their faces a mixture of intense concentration and sheer awe. I taught them the mechanics of flight, the intricate dance of hand and foot required to master a Black Hawk. But I taught them something more. I taught them what to do when the engine sputters, when the weather turns, when the fear begins to creep in at the edges of their discipline. I taught them about the noise. There are going to be 1,000 voices telling you that you can't, I'd say over the intercom, our helicopter hovering steadily over the pine forests. Some of those voices will be out there, and some of them will be right here, inside your own head. They'll tell you you're not good enough, not smart enough, not brave enough. Your job as a pilot is to fly the aircraft. Your job as a person is to recognize that all those voices, they are just noise. Your instruments, your training, your gut, that's the signal. You learn to listen to the signal and tune out the noise. I was passing on the lesson that Sarge had given me, the wisdom I'd learned in a motel room in Utah. I was taking my own hard-won piece and turning it into a legacy. A year after the incident, I drove home to Georgia for Christmas. I wasn't sure what to expect. But the tension that had once been the constant atmosphere in that house was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, almost hesitant, calm. My father was different. He was quieter, more reserved. He seemed smaller. He showed me into his office, the same room where I had made my stand. And there, on the bookshelf, sitting between a dusty trophy for a fishing tournament and a framed photo of his first construction crew, was the cheap plastic helmet from my birthday. It wasn't hidden away in a box of shame. It was displayed like a piece of art. "I keep that there," he said, not looking at me, but at the helmet. "To remind me." He didn't say what it reminded him of, and I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Our relationship never became a movie of the week special. There were no tearful, dramatic hugs, no sudden, miraculous understanding. But it became honest. For the first time, we talked. Really talked. He would ask me questions about my job, genuine questions born of a desire to understand. He wanted to know about engine torque, about lift dynamics, about what it felt like to fly at night. He was trying, in his own clumsy, imperfect way, to see the world through my eyes. 3 years after the Utah landing, I was invited to be the keynote speaker at a graduation ceremony for a new class of Army aviators at Fort Novosel. As I stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of crisp dress uniforms and the proud, beaming faces of their families, I saw my parents sitting in the third row. My mother was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. My father was just watching me, his expression unreadable. When I began to speak, my voice was clear and calm. "They call me a hero because of 12 minutes in the sky over Utah," I said. But the truth is, courage isn't found in 12 dramatic minutes. Courage is the thousands of quiet hours in the simulator. It's the nights you spend studying until your eyes burn. It's the mornings you get up and do it all over again, especially on the days you doubt yourself the most. I paused, my eyes finding my parents in the crowd. The greatest lesson I've learned is this. You do not need anyone else's permission to be excellent. You don't need their approval to be worthy. Everything else is just noise. After the ceremony, as families were embracing their graduates, my father made his way through the crowd toward me. He didn't hug me. He just came and stood in front of me for a moment. Then he slowly raised his hand and placed it on my shoulder, his rough, calloused fingers resting gently on the gold oak leaf of my major's insignia. "That was a good speech, Rachel," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. He looked me straight in the eye, and I could see that his own were wet with tears. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out in a raw, broken whisper. "I'm sorry I didn't see. Not for what you did. I'm sorry I didn't see the person you were trying so hard to become." All the anger, all the resentment I had held onto for years, simply dissolved in that moment. There was nothing left to fight against. "I know, Dad," I said softly. It wasn't perfect, but it was true. And as I turned to walk away, a newly commissioned second lieutenant by my side asking me a question about flight dynamics, I took a quiet inventory of my own mind. I listened for the old echoes, the familiar whispers of doubt, the ghost of my father's disapproval, and I realized, with a profound and silent sense of peace, that there was nothing there. The noise, finally, was gone. Thank you for walking this path with me. My story is proof that the loudest noise isn't always the one that deserves to be heard. We all have voices in our lives, from family, from the world, and especially from within, that tell us we aren't enough. The journey to find your own signal, to trust your own worth, is the most important flight you'll ever take. If my story resonated with you, I would be honored if you would subscribe to the Chosen Revenge channel for more stories about overcoming the noise. And in the comments below, please share one word that defines your own strength.